So good afternoon, everybody. Voor géad míle fáilte go dtí an webinar an le an nómh. Today, I'd really like to welcome my guest, Professor Ciaran Sugrue. Ciaran is Professor and Chair of Education at the School of Education, UCD. Prior to taking up this position in 2011, Ciaran worked at the Faculty of Education in the University of Cambridge and also at St. Patrick's College, Drumcondra. Ciaran has worked in the Irish education system in a variety of capacities, including as a teacher, school inspector, teacher educator, and a researcher. Ciaran's research interests are broad and include teachers' lives and work, educational reform, and organisational change. Ciaran has many publications in the field of educational leadership, including a recently co-edited book, Leading Higher Education as and for Public Good, Rekindling Education as Praxis. Today, Ciaran will focus on the notion of deliberative leadership and discuss whether it errs towards adjectivalism or a distinct contribution. We look forward to hearing your thoughts, Ciaran, and so for now, it's over to you.
Okay, thank you, Gavin, and thank you for the welcome. In fact, I'm tempted, and welcome to everybody who's out there somewhere in cyberspace on a rather dreary May afternoon. So thank you for being here. I hope you will find the conversation of interest and well, hopefully thought-provoking also. I'm tempted to say to Gavin, apart from being grateful to be invited to participate in this, one of the phrases that I've grown to come to detest in recent times, especially on radio, where whoever the compere happens to be, whoever it is who is the guest invariably says, "Thank you for having me." So while I'm genuine in saying thank you for having me, I still have difficulty in the 24/7 news cycle why it is that people have to thank the compere of the program who desperately want them to keep the news cycle moving, as it were. But that's just perhaps just me and a general quirkiness. So to the title on the screen there, so we can become a little more focused now that you have adjusted to listening to my tones. As Gavin said, deliberative leadership, and I'm asking the question, is this a distinct contribution, or is it just more noise of a sort, labeled a number of years ago by Peter Grahn as adjectivalism, and by that he meant all the different versions from democratic to instructional to transformational to, and of course, as we know in the Irish policy context, distributed leadership, which Grahn, of course, along with Jim Spillane from an empirical point of view, are typically accredited with sort of putting it on the map. So against that background, let me, hopefully the slides will work. And so I suppose this is part of the evolution of my own thinking about leadership under various guises, as it were, over the past decade or so. So what you're looking at from left to right in front of you are three books that I've had a hand in to varying degrees in the course of that decade. The first one, Professional Responsibility, New Horizons of Praxis, and the one in the middle, which I did on my own, Unmasking School Leadership, which was based on, from memory, 60 interviews with primary principals over a 10-year period, which is why on the cover there you will see a longitudinal life history of school leaders. And then the more recent one, which Gavin mentioned, which is Leading Higher Education as and for Public Good, Rekindling Education as Praxis. And so borrowing various elements from the thinking that went into putting those three books together. As I said, over a decade. Professional Responsibility was published in 2011, The Unmasking in 2015, and The Leading Higher Education last year, 2020. So, like I say, what I'm going to do is to say some general things first, and then draw on elements from each of those three pieces of work, as it were, to indicate to you how, along with others, I've arrived at deliberative leadership, but also with a view to sort of saying, why is this now timely? So let's see where we get with that. So tensions in the field, I suppose there will always be tensions in the field of education, because education is a political issue. And it won't hopefully have escaped your attention, or maybe it did and you're the better for it, but that the government plan for education up to 2025 is that we would be the best education system in Europe. So in other words, if you wanted an example of increased competitiveness, well, in order for us to be the best, everybody else must be second best or worse, as it were. So how useful is it to talk up competitiveness in the education system? And, you know, parents' public league tables from whatever quarter, all in a way contribute to that competitiveness, and even reading transcripts with current principals very recently, I'm talking about competitiveness between schools, musicals, websites, what you put on the website, and all the rest of it. And of course, part of that landscape also, as we know, the proliferation of agencies, Exam Commission, NCCA, Teaching Council, NCSE, you know, and the list goes on and on. Arguably, all of these agencies, in one way or another, have consequences for school leadership, because they demand something, whether that's a policy or a particular practice or whatever. So notice that what's happening here is the external environment is such that there's an increased level of demand. And if you look beyond our shores then to the international arena, it's not all that long ago that ministers of education meeting in Europe, if issues around national education were mentioned, it would be told very quickly, that's our responsibility, it's none of your business. That whole sort of degree of autonomy has been now eroded, so you get more alliance between EU and OECD, and of course you can't mention OECD without mentioning PISA, and you don't need me to rehearse what happened with PISA 2009, and on the back of that, the opportunity to nationally to introduce the literacy numeracy strategy. Whether it was necessary or not is a whole other day's work. And then, of course, through the COVID period, we've all had to grapple with technologies that we might have chosen not to use if we had a choice in the matter. So I suppose even the fact of our collective presence here this evening is indicative in some respects of the degree to which we've become comfortable with Zoom as a medium of communication, but more importantly, I suppose, all of the problems, if you like, that are being created by technology, social media. And I have a book here beside me that you might be able to see that, Reclaiming Conversation, the Power of Talk in the Digital Age. And a growing concern that some of those children that you're dealing with in schools are losing the capacity to communicate with one another because of social media. So far from it increasing communication, it is in particular ways, but our capacity to engage and communicate, and more importantly, and I think this is a huge issue for education, it is through our interaction with others that we develop a capacity for empathy. If we don't have empathy in the world, then it's much more likely, and as we already know, the communication thing becomes echo chambers. And of course, the keyboard warriors and all of that is, in a sense, anti-communication. It's cancel culture. And so, you know, that comes back to school leadership, but also the purposes of schooling. And, you know, rather than the competitiveness, what kind of citizens, well, in the first instance, what kind of society do we want? And then, of course, what kind of education system would best contribute to that kind of society, which does force us to think more about citizenship and engagement rather than points or maybe calculated grades in one way or another. So in all of that, the tension is between individualism, which arguably we have at this stage over-egged, as it were, as against a more collective sense of purposes of education and indeed the leading schools and what that entails. So in that regard, if there's a sense that the big post-World War II settlement was essentially a welfare state, which we came relatively late to, but to create social safety nets so that, you know, that we would look after one another to varying degrees. There's a sort of a growing sense, and I find it very interesting, that often it's economists increasingly who are writing this, who are saying that consensus, that general agreement is broken. So what we now need is a new social contract. The title of this book is What We Owe Each Other, a New Social Contract. So part of that social contract is, in a way, what are the purposes of education? And then, of course, in turn, as I've indicated, so what therefore does leading schools entail? Okay, so still part of that bigger picture, if you like, is that, and I'll make a distinction here and I'll pick up on it later, is to make the point that it's possible, because of all those external demands that I indicated earlier, all of those demands may be perceived for those in school as a demand to be accountable. And we know over the past decade in particular how easily words like accountability and transparency sort of trip off of the tongue of politicians and policymakers and the commentariat in general. But by and large, we don't hear as much about, so what's my professional responsibility in this particular instance? And that's a thread that I'm going to be weaving through the conversation as it moves on. But it, in the first instance, suggests that we can be accountable, but not necessarily be behaving in a professionally responsible manner. So I'm making a clear distinction, which I'll come back to, between accountability and professional responsibility that we need to build on as the conversation goes. Also, the notion of public good and education arguably as one of a key element of the social contract that I just mentioned, that it's accessible to all and that it contributes to the public good as opposed to private good, or, you know, back to the accumulation of points and grade inflation before calculated grades ever existed, and so on, and the extent to which that promotes a degree of self-interest. And it's not an argument for saying we can abolish self-interest. That would be silly. But it's where we strike the balance between the individual and the collective. But also that is a matter of a sort of a moral and a political decision. So the issue of what are the values and beliefs and dispositions that contribute to the creation of that social contract, as it were. And if that social contract is largely broken now, then we need a much bigger debate, arguably a leadership function in itself, to bring that into force. In contrast, the market forces, and you know, ESRI, Emer Smith and her colleagues will tell us that more than 50% of those in post-primary schools do not attend their local school. So it fuels the issue, which of course is a market-oriented notion of choice. And of course, choice for some who have the resources and the wherewithal means actually no choice for much more than those who exercise choice. Though in the Irish context, according to that research, it's as much as 50%. So fairly evenly distributed, but is that sufficient as part of the social contract or not? Around issues of inclusion, and as we know, over the last several years, we've heard lots of talk about schools not taking on responsibility for their fair share of those with additional learning needs and so on. And I made the point a little earlier about, you know, developing empathy and so on. And the word phubbing, I came across this recently, so I thought I'd stick it in there. And it was a new term to me, but of course, when if you haven't encountered it either, then you will recognize it very quickly when I tell you it's about everybody, whether this is the kids in the lunchroom in school or the staff in the staff room, everybody sitting around the table, all busy on their phones. And again, it's back to the issue about conversation as opposed to the whole sort of social media circus, as it were. So phubbing, we're all guilty to varying degrees. I've already alluded to the accountability and the responsibility bit, which begs the question about the purposes of education, but more importantly, from a leadership position, whether you're in a formal leadership position in the school, you know, be it principal, deputy, AP1, AP2, or you're an informal leader in the sense that you don't have a designated remunerated role. Arguably, if everybody is a leader, then how much agency, and this is an important issue around expectations for leadership. Some people in positions of power and authority arguably have considerably more agency, more power to act than somebody who's a newly qualified teacher and only finding their feet within the school community. So it would be wrong to expect that the same agency is available to everybody. That flies in the face of what we know about power and the distribution of power, even under the guise of distributed leadership. One way or the other, all of these things add up to school leadership is complex. It's context bound, so it's kind of cliched, but nevertheless true to say all schools are similar in some respects, all schools are different in particular respects. So the notion that there is a prescription, the one fit for all, if you like, just doesn't wash. And so there has to be room for professional judgment. Therefore, there has to be some degree of relative autonomy, but also, and I've been thinking a good deal about this recently in the context of middle leadership, of is the role of the middle leaders to challenge those in more senior roles to, in a sense, push them out of their comfort zone, and this is the way it has always been around here, and how much space and opportunity are they given to, in a sense, challenge the comfort zone of those in the senior ranks, let's say. Maybe that's for a discussion on another occasion, or maybe even later on. So that's the big picture, if you like, that confounds and influences the decision-making at the level of the school. So here what I want to do now is drawing on the first of the three books that I mentioned earlier. So I stuck in a kind of a squashed version of the cover up in the corner there to sort of keep this in mind. So this is a distinction that Scandinavian colleagues have made between what they're calling the language and logics of responsibility and accountability, which I've sort of mentioned already. But what I want to add at this point is a phrase that I picked up a number of years ago, which kind of fits very well here, and I find it rather useful, is to understand that language does our thinking for us. We're born into speech communities. We acquire language, much of it informally. So the notion that somehow we're in control of the language is probably wide of the mark, that the language is much more in control of us, as it were. And so in that sense, language does our thinking for us. So we must be very aware of the language we use and the implications of that. So they make the distinction, as you can see in these lists here. Professional autonomy uses a rather different and distinct language from the language of accountability. So professional responsibility is based in professional judgment. Situated judgment I mentioned earlier. Trust is a word that increasingly gets sort of bandied around. Of course it's important. That we have internal evaluation, which some quarters might suggest, well, that's what SSE is about. It might or it might not be. That there's a degree of negotiation and so on down along the list, and that people are professionally proactive. On the other side, the language and logic of accountability is defined by government and government policies, that there are standards to be met, that the control or the locus of control is external to the school rather than the discretionary judgment that we might have over in the left-hand column. There are predetermined indicators of what counts as success. The language is more likely to speak a language of the economy and legality, as it were. Political goals, we will be the best in Europe by 2025. And all of that induces a kind of a compliance and a conformity. And if you only think about the number of times in the staff room or elsewhere over the last couple of years that you've perhaps used the phrase yourself, or indeed a colleague used the same phrase of ticking the box. And, you know, by the way, I should add, this is not a rant against accountability. We have to be accountable, but my point is that we can be accountable, but not necessarily be behaving in a professionally responsible manner, and that in order to behave in a professionally responsible manner, we need a language that fits with notions about professional responsibility, that gives us relative autonomy, and that speaks a language of education as opposed to a language of markets and economy and so on. Okay. All right, I was going to say, so now, I don't know what happened there. Sorry, I need to go back. There we are. So sorry about the little jumping around there. So in the Unmasking School Leadership book, and you know, as I indicated earlier, this was done in a sense over a 10-year period. So I got to look at leadership, admittedly in primary schools only, over time. But one of the big issues, now we complain today about a relative absence of mobility, but we've, you know, deputy principalships are now more competitive and open, and the whole seniority and postal responsibility and so on has gotten sort of reformed. So the big issue in a way for school leaders is that I have a staff and that there's limited mobility. So I have to be very careful that I don't, as it were, dirty my bib with my colleagues, because I have to meet them tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow. So the evidence strongly suggested to me that as a kind of an Irish default characteristic, and I know it's sort of dangerous to indulge in cultural stereotypes, perhaps even within the confines of schools, to sort of say we like to be liked. So, and as a consequence of that we have considerable difficulty having what some people rather euphemistically describe as difficult conversations. When we have to call out a colleague, have that professional conversation. So with apologies to Vygotsky, of course, I began to think about this notion of professional distance as opposed to the degree of proximity which inhibits the difficulty of having the space to have that professional conversation, thus the notion of the rather contradictory notion of proximity and distance and the sort of tension that creates. And so the notion was that where those three circles meet in the middle is where the personal and the professional and the social come together, but also fueled by notions about values, beliefs, and our kind of worldview without getting too grand about it. So the space to have those professional conversations, that little space in the middle, is rather confined. And so when, so my sort of thinking was, well, we need to increase the area of proximal distance if we're to have a more robust leadership, particularly you could argue now in the context where everybody is a leader under the official policy of distributed leadership. So we need a different kind of space. So you can obviously see the limits of my expertise with PowerPoint, but so by resizing my three circles, you create a much bigger space, as it were. So now there's greater potential for exercising professional responsibility, but also of exercising agency, and so building leadership capacity. So between the tension between professional responsibility and accountability, and then the like to be liked and the zone of proximal distance, we now are beginning to understand what the space we create, I now want to fill, as it were, or to use with what, along with colleagues, we've been calling for a while now, deliberative leadership. So here we come to borrowing, as it were, from the leading higher education. So I suppose it's important to recognize here that beliefs and values worldview, which I mentioned in the last slide, have implications not just for how we see the world, but also how we act in the world. So, in other words, values are important, but I think it's also, having asserted that, it's important to recognize values aren't fixed either. And we need to recognize that, but it also makes negotiation or deliberation more complicated in a sort of a society in flux. We've only to think about the major social changes in Irish society over the last 20 years that couldn't have happened, you know, in various referenda if people's values, their orientations and the dispositions those created hadn't changed. Or think of it slightly differently, is that, sorry, the slides are acting up again, but it's my, so think about it in the context of my zone of proximal distance. In a more tolerant society, we created more space and opportunity for actually what Andy Hargreaves calls principled disagreement. And that too is an important notion. More important, I think, than, well, why don't we agree to differ? Because agree to differ isn't good enough. It's about arriving at what we're increasingly, if there's a disagreement in the school, and I have difficulty, and people may not agree with me on this, that we're very keen in leadership programs to say, oh, we have to put something in on conflict resolution. Well, I'm not actually convinced by that, and I'll over the next couple of minutes, I'll explain, is because if you have to have conflict resolution, you've already lost something that I would say is important, and that arguably deliberative leadership tries to avoid. Now, of course, it's not a perfect world, and neither are we perfect in it. But as a sort of a proactive thing, deliberative leadership tries to work at finding legitimate compromise. And I'll come back to that again at the end. So we know the importance of trust. Increasingly, we're being pushed, if not going there voluntarily, towards greater collaboration. I'm saying education is a public good, and therefore, how do we behave from a day-to-day point of view, whether it's leadership decisions or I'm in my own classroom, in a way that's consistent with that, rather than have an mission statement which is up on a website or up on a wall, and then we go about our business as if that didn't matter. So the professional responsibility is to try to, without getting into notions too much at least of having all your ducks in a row, but that your orientation, your values, your disposition orientates you towards behaving in a particular way that's consistent with those values or the mission statement and so on. While recognizing, as I did earlier, that at different career stages, different positions, people have courage to act in particular ways. We know from younger colleagues feel disempowered, often to some extent by old codgers like me who are fond of talking or not shy about expressing views. So there's a bigger issue around professional responsibility, particularly in the context of staff meetings, about how they are conducted and whose voices are being heard, which brings me to what this is borrowed from Habermas in particular about communicative action, which may be similar to some of you. But if you think about these 5 elements, and I'll go through each of them briefly, then the issue in a way is we need to be tolerant and listen to different views expressed by our colleagues, as opposed to, no, we can't have that. Tolerance and respect for others. This is beginning to sound like the code of conduct for teachers, but, and in some respects, because it's under these principles, or tenets as I'm calling them, are underpinned by particular values and value orientation. So we must work towards building at least a shared understanding, which is collective will formation. But it's not about creating consensus. It's about reaching legitimate compromise. Now, I said during the last slide, I'd come back to that. It's by no means certain what a legitimate compromise is. But if the commitment is, we have to sit around the table for long enough. If we take an extreme example of Gaza and Israel at the moment, sooner rather than later, there has to be a legitimate compromise that both sides will agree on, because if they don't, more and more people are going to die and it's quite miserable and so on. So there's a desperate need for legitimate compromise. Also, and this was my comment earlier about, you know, perhaps the role of middle leadership in schools is to challenge traditional views and maybe the dominant or a dominant aspect of school culture. And that might be actually a significant role for the meat in the sandwich, but need to consider also the courage to act, and how senior or otherwise these people are. The possibility, this is a bit controversial. I know why it's there, because at an earlier stage this was written as sort of a charter of sorts for deliberation in high schools in Sweden. So the notion that you could have a powwow without the authoritative figure of the teacher or the principal or whatever present. I think in a context where it's all adults in the room, namely in the staff, then I'm not sure about how far I push that one, but I'll park it for now. I'm conscious of time, of course, at this stage. So you'll be glad to hear that this is, well, actually, this is the second last slide. There's one to go after. So what I've tried to do here is back to my zone of proximal distance and to put in the tenets of deliberative communication. So you see now down the middle, and you can certainly see also the limitations of my technological competence here. So deliberation, tolerance, respect, listen, challenge, working towards legitimate compromises. We create a culture of leadership in our schools that creates the space and opportunity in which we can hear all the voices, be tolerant and listen and respectful, challenge if necessary, but work towards legitimate compromise. And arguably, we could, in a world of the social media that I described earlier, of echo chambers, of reinforcing things that you already believe in, and of course what has come out of that is cancel culture. And so that's not something, we have potential for factions in every community and so on, but so extending the zone of proximal distance, or maybe even it might be rechristened at this stage, the zone of deliberative leadership, with these principles as its operating practice, as it were. How different might schools' cultures become over time, and would they be better? Would there be better leadership and a stronger culture and a better place for staff and students to be? That's a question I'm sort of putting out there. So this is the final slide where I've tried to bring all of these things into play. So on the left-hand side, we have the principles that I've just been talking about. Added in there for reasons that I won't go into now are what are generally referred to in the literature as intellectual virtues, which we could all do with exercising. Open-mindedness, generosity, honesty and courage, and they're being repeated for each one of the value of integrity, respect, open-mindedness, trustworthy, and you can see a sort of a degree of overlap between values and intellectual virtues. I suppose being virtuous in some respects might be said to have good values, positive values that contribute to public good rather than promote individualism, selfishness, and so on. And so under the guise of legitimate compromise, and I know I had that phrase earlier, and I, for one reason or another, I pass it. We all have our own webs of commitments made up of our beliefs and values, personal lives, professional lives, and so on. And so there's a sense in which the need for legitimate compromise in the first instance is my web of commitments isn't yours. And likewise, with every other colleague on your staff, they're at different career stages, they have different family responsibilities, domestic responsibilities, intergenerational responsibilities. So we must recognize that, while at the same time, our professional responsibility to act in a professionally responsible manner is to find those legitimate compromises in a principled kind of way through deliberative communication. And in the process, you'll notice in that final column that from practice to praxis. And of course, with some genuflection as far back as Aristotle, what praxis tries to do is to bring reflection and values and decision making and the actions that flow from that into generative sort of process, so that as teams and committees and so on, we are learning about our leadership and our professional responsibility as we deliberate, and so that contributes in an ongoing way to building capacity in schools that arguably we haven't done up to now. So I've gone on a little longer than I thought, but I'm very happy to say thank you for your attention. I hope you have found something of interest here, and I'm more than happy to answer questions you might have or you might want to run away at this stage. Ciaran,
thank you very much for a very thought-provoking presentation. And just to, again, to echo what you've just said, is to invite everybody to, if they wish, pose a question through the chat function or the Q&A function, reflection, whatever you like, really. Ciaran, I suppose I have a few questions myself, having...
only one at a time now, Gavin.
Having just, well, I suppose in the process of preparing for today, but also just my thought process as you were presenting over the past kind of half an hour or so. And one of the questions, I suppose, is to come back right to the title, is to say, so is it adjectivalism or a distinct contribution? My thought is that it's a distinct contribution. Why so?
I hope you're not just being nice to me at the end of this. I think it's a distinct contribution. It of course has some similarities with, say, Philip Woods' work on democratic leadership. But I think what this does, more than, say, that work in particular, but others also, is that it puts values back into consideration, that we can't ignore them, and that the whole marketization has, in many respects, shrunken the space where that can actually happen. Now, there are lots of people respond to that would say, yeah, it gets very messy then, because values are personal as well as professional, and so the potential to get heated or to disagree and refuse to communicate. But that's where the principles or the tenets of deliberative communication, in a sense, tries to put a frame on how it is we act professionally in the world. And so trying to use that language of professional responsibility along with the tenets of deliberative communication, I think certainly is intended to create something that, if we ever had it, we've certainly lost significant elements of, you know, being respectful, being good listeners, that in a noisier, more rushed culture. Now, you know, it's also fair to say, oh, come on, you know, the world is moving at such a pace now. Do you really think we have time for this kind of implicit navel gazing that's being suggested here? And my response to that is, who said all of this pace is necessarily a good thing? And in fact, I think one of the lessons that certainly was being put out there through COVID was that apart from getting rid of the traffic and we could hear the birds sing, but also how people reorganized their lives around working remotely, and how it gave them time for family and going for a walk or whatever, is that suddenly people realized that there are alternatives, and that maybe what all of this is attempting to say is we need to work hard or harder at creating, discussing, deliberating on, and acting on the world differently, because the pathway we've been on has been largely self and planetary destruction. You know, now that's a sort of a big sweeping statement, but it tries in a sense to capture the sentiment behind deliberative leadership.
Yeah.
I think is timely.
Yeah, and I mean, when you draw comparisons to Philip Woods' work on democratic leadership, I suppose you could argue to a point perhaps deliberative leadership is of our time, given what some people might say are threats to democracy, with particular political currents that contribute in part to these disruptive kind of episodic things that I think are somewhere behind what you're saying, that deliberative leadership faces up to and tries to abridge in a values anchored manner.
Yes, and you know, again, it's a rather sweeping statement, but if the Western world has over-egged individualism to the point of, you know, social fragmentation and, you know, exacerbated by a degree of competitiveness, then finding the common ground, and arguably education is the common ground that is accessible to all. And it's not by accident I happen to have it here, but Robert Reich, American, The Common Good, you know, the social contract that I mentioned earlier, and some of you will have come across Martin Carney, former governor of the Bank in Canada and more recently UK, and for an economist to be writing about values, building a better world for all. So I think that there's a sense in which aspects of this is a sort of a work in progress on the one hand, but so are all these others. But to me, they're collectively pointing to we need to do things differently. And so my response is, well, let's try deliberative communication as a means towards creating that better world for all. Now, the more pragmatists will say, okay, so what does that look like in practice? And I think it's paying attention to all of these things still on the screen, but sufficiently reflective to recognize with a degree of humility that I don't have all the answers any more than anybody else. So the notion that there's some sort of magic bullet or holy grail that we need to find in leadership, that somehow it's going to be sorted for all time. And I find myself often in conversations such as this, you know, borrowing Wittgenstein's phrase, which Joe Dunn used in the title of his book, all those years ago of back to the rough ground. That, sorry, intrusion, is that the kind of decision making made through a deliberative process is not predetermined. It's about the listening, the recognizing, the differences and seeking legitimate compromises, or we use build in schools and classrooms.
Mm-hmm. There was just a small bit of line breakage up there, Ciaran, ever so slightly. So I just kind of missed the last small bit of that. But if I could just move to the next question, which is maybe something that connects in part to what we're saying, which in a way is talking at a system level. I think it might be easy to watch this presentation back and say, here's a set of practices for school leaders in, at the school level. Can the system leadership take away elements of your argument today as well? And particularly, we know that many principals have lamented the kind of communication perhaps felt outside maybe the kind of commitments of the system during COVID, especially. That's kind of behind my question, I suppose. So
yeah, and I'm not entirely convinced all of the time. I think some of that is self-serving, that, oh, decisions were made and I wasn't told before the rest of the world got to hear about this. Now, of course, if you think about the tenets of deliberative communication, respect for the other might very well say you don't go public on this until you let the stakeholders know, and so on. But that almost reinforces my last point about the rough ground. The fact that you succeeded yesterday is no guarantee that you'll succeed tomorrow. So there's a sense in which all of this is provisional, but that we need to become more sophisticated at the way we practice this. And these are tools at our disposal. And they're not going to tell you what the decision is. You have to still work with them to find the answer that's legitimate in your context.
Mm-hmm.
So in that sense, that's why, I said earlier, 'tis easier to be accountable, to tick the box and say, that's grand. We can't be had now because we don't have a policy on mobile phones in the school or whatever it happens to be.
Mm-hmm.
Was there suitable deliberation about, well, what are the implications of this? Now, every decision, there are potentially unseen consequences, but in fact, deliberative leadership out by a psychologist in America back in 1988. And one of the claims, it was an analysis done on the biographies of 39 US presidents up to Reagan. And that those who were of a deliberative bent were not self-motivated, were not sort of in it for what they could get out of it, and so on. And were slow to make decisions without, in a sense, my language here, hearing all voices. So there is some substance to the notion of being the deliberative leader, even if, the implications even in the 88 paper was that somehow, It's all too slow, and who decides when something is too slow?
I suppose the capacity, though, to be able to do that as well is contingent on, and this connects to a question actually that's just come in which refers to your kind of comment on the varying levels of agency teachers may have, but also I think connects to your point in middle leadership. In a way, to be a deliberative leader and to practice that, you rely on others having and exerting their agency to actually be part of that conversation.
Correct. And that's kind of back to, extending that space sufficiently that people feel comfortable and are sufficiently confident and courageous to speak up and speak out, as it were.
Which probably demands both structural and cultural and relational elements, I suppose, which your Venn diagram begins to capture, although it's
poorly.
Well, the beginnings probably of something that's going to become more expansive as this conception kind of is embedded in practice. And I think one of the ways that we're still beginning to just figure out the tensions in practices does connect to distributed leadership, which as well you mentioned at the start. And because it's so connected to leadership policy in Ireland, I think it merits a question. And it connects to that notion of legitimate compromise I think you raise. And as I say, now we're in a distributed leadership policy context. Is legitimate compromise therefore both essential and yet something we need to work on realizing still in the Irish context, given the sociocultural, political legacies of old that maybe still pervade?
Sure, and it connected also with the point I made about we're inclined to think as values anchoring things. Right, which they do, of course, but we shouldn't confuse their anchoring behavior, as it were, with the fact that they are written in stone forever and amen. They're not. And, I cited the last 20 years of change in Irish society as an example. Now, you could sort of pose the additional but to what extent have values actually changed, say, because of the way we voted, in the marriage referendum or the abortion and so on? That's a much more complicated question. But even if values change at a glacial pace, it sort of indicates that even the relationship between values and action, aren't sort of, wedded entirely like that. That there are times when they're somewhat more elastic, as it were. And that's part of the zone, but also the possibility for legitimate compromise.
Yeah, and it probably connects to the, going right back to Aristotle, who also got a name drop today, this whole idea of phronesis. And
yes.
Yeah. Well, Ciaran, we're coming up on the hour, if not just gone ever so slightly past. And I'd just like to really thank you for being the guest on today's webinar, particularly important to me, having been my PhD supervisor. So just to again say thank you for today, and to the audience as well for your questions and for your attendance. And have a nice evening, everybody, and we'll speak again soon.
Slán.
Slán go fóill.